Thanks, God. Good morning. Great to be with you. My name's Matt, if I haven't met you before. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. We've had some troubles with our little clicker, so I'm just going to experiment. Hello. Hello. Things are working. That's good. I wonder whether you've ever had one of those moments in life where you find yourself sitting on the fence about a decision that you need to make. Anyone had a moment like that in life where you find yourself sitting on the fence? Confession time, full disclosure. There are some, actually many, decisions in my life that I suck at making. I am a chronic sitterer on the fencerer, if that's a term. Recently, I've spent a little bit of time at airports around breakfast time, and I will come into the terminal and I'm looking for a feed, and I will go past every single food outlet before making a decision. The other day, I found myself walking through 3 different security checkpoints. You imagine the hassle of that, going into different terminals to see whether they had better food options, before finally settling on 2 boiled eggs and 4 pieces of baby spinach, nearly missing my flight, and it cost me about a day's worth of wages. I'm a chronic sitterer on the fencerer. I have countless examples of this in my life. I've got a splurge account. Any barefoot investors? Yeah, all right. I've got a splurge account. It's an account that doesn't need to go through the family treasurer. And I can spend on whatever I want. In theory, this is excellent. It must see hundreds of dollars go into it every year. Money's from birthdays, gifts, slice of my salary goes into there every month. But I cannot decide what to spend it on. And contrary to what you must think, that there must be hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in this account, contrary to what you think, there is not a huge pile of money in there. I honestly believe there must be a little gremlin inside my computer just eating away at ones and zeros. But the family treasurer has helped me see that it's because I haven't consciously decided on a worthy goal, a worthy investment, that I just randomly spend this money on little things in my life. Little coffees. I'm a sweet tooth. I love little treats by myself. And I look back at the expenses and I think, I don't even remember going to that cafe. I don't remember doing that thing. What a dumb thing to spend my personal savings on. And those little moments bleed my bank account dry. What am I getting at? We're indecisive, or Matt Straw is indecisive. We're indecisive. I think we're indecisive about the little things. I think sometimes we're indecisive about the big things in our lives as well. In this passage, we see a nation indecisive about whether or not they can trust God. Their hearts are wavering between God and other options. And I wonder whether that's true about us and our faith, us and Jesus. We waver between the true God and something else. We waver as to who is the real God. Who are we living for? Who are we serving? And the question of this passage, I think, is kind of simple. Which God is real? Which God is worth living for? Which God can you trust with your life? Which God can you safely land on? And so I want to ask a couple of questions about that this morning. The questions are this: what does wavering look like? What does wavering mean? What is that? What is the cost of wavering? Is there a cost? And then finally, what's going to stop you from wavering? My pulpit's wavering here. I wonder what's going to stop it from wavering. Let me see. Maybe moving it around. There we go. We're done. All right. So firstly, what does wavering look like? What does it look like to waver? Where do I get this from? Well, Elijah says to the people, Scott, you read it so well. 10 minutes of reading there, mate. Love your work. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. I want you to notice there's something very interesting about this to me. Firstly, he assumes that the people are wavering just between 2 opinions. That's the first thing he assumes, just between 2 opinions. Now, this is interesting. You've probably picked up over the last few weeks that Baal, here, this is the carving that Grant did in his backyard last week. Baal was the Canaanite god of fertility and weather, specifically of thunderstorms. But the name was also used as a title, meaning Lord or God, and it was applied to a number of different gods in the ancient Near East. In other words, Baal worship, and this is explicit here actually, Baal worship was the worship of many different gods. There was a god for everything, a god for rain, a god for wealth, a god for success, a god for love. This is exactly what Elijah says to Ahab. He says, I'm not the troubler. I've not made trouble, when Ahab accuses him for that. He says, rather, you and your father's family have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Notice the plural there. And yet, Elijah says actually they're just wavering between two opinions, God and something else, not between God and all these other gods. I think that's very interesting. Secondly, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, and this is even clearer when you read it in the Hebrew text or just read the commentaries like I do. The word for wavering here is the same for in verse 21 when they dance around the altar. I think I've got the passage here. They called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response, no one answered, and they danced. This is the same word for wavering, actually. And I think this is really interesting. In other words, I think the point can be made, there's no such thing actually as sitting on the fence. There's no such thing as having not made up your mind when it comes to who you worship. To waver is to dance to the beat of another god. To not believe in the true God is to actually trust another God. I think that's very interesting. What he's saying here actually is there's no neutrality either. There's no neutrality on the issue of who you worship. You're either trusting the true God or you're trusting another God. It's very interesting. We'll come back to this in a moment. So that's what Elijah is saying. There's no such thing as not worshiping, and there's only two options when you're worshiping, God, the true God, or something false. Now, how does this apply to us today? Well, some of us would think, I'm an atheist. I don't even worship. What are you talking about? There is nothing in my life that I do that is remotely religious. Although you've turned up to Vine Church today or online, it's great to have you here. Others of us might think, well, it's not as if I worship another God. I just haven't made up my mind yet. I'm in this neutral space. I'm just thinking about this. I want you to hold on to these thoughts. We'll come back to it in a moment. We'll work it out together. The next thing I want us to think about, though, is what is... before we get to what's the cost? I'll just go back there. What does wavering look like? Notice what wavering actually looks like in this passage. It says they danced, and a better translation is actually to limp or to hobble. It's bad dancing. The picture actually is of somebody dancing with a broken ankle. I was going to do that for you, but I thought, my ankles are good. I don't know how to dance with a broken ankle. If I danced, it would just look really good, right? So I'm not going to do that. But I've been to a wedding recently, and towards the end of the night, some people were very, very drunk. And yet they went to the dance floor. I just think it was a bad decision. And as you watch them dance, and they're very drunk, you think, turn off the cameras. Like, this is so bad. This is ugly dancing. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? This is really bad. This is embarrassing. It's sad. And I think that's part of the point here, actually, that Elijah is communicating, or then the author's communicating, and they danced and they wavered. You know, it might feel good to you or even feel good at first, but the author's point, it's not pretty. If you are wavering, if you do not trust in the real God, you're putting your trust in another God, it doesn't look good. Your life does not look good. And the one who knows God, knows the real God and what he has to offer, they look at you and to them it looks horrible, it looks awkward. Because it's not how it's meant to be. And that doesn't fill a Christian with pride. I think it fills us with compassion. It should fill us with compassion. Maybe that's actually how you're feeling in your life right now, is maybe you're in a state of wavering. You haven't chosen the real God, and maybe actually you know this feeling and this experience. Maybe you've felt like this dance was pretty cool, but actually you've been doing it for a little bit too long, and it started to become a bit of a limp, a bit of a drunken dance. So we're going to move forward, and we've still got to answer what is wavering to some extent, but I want us to think about the cost of wavering, and this will come up here. What's the cost of their wavering? What's the cost of wavering? So amidst this sad picture of this drunken dance, amidst this sad picture, there's a bit of black humor, actually, a bit of dark comedy. After hours of calling out to Baal, after hours of hobbling around the altar and nothing happening, Elijah taunts them, he mocks them. You can imagine the cheek. And he says this, I love this, at noon. This is 3 or 4 hours after they've been doing this. Elijah began to mock them, taunt them. He says, shout louder. He said, surely he is a god. Perhaps he's in a deep thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder. We'll come back to that. Let's do that. I love this. He says, surely he's a god. Perhaps he's in deep thought, busy or traveling. You studied this in your Connect groups this week, and you probably came across the idea that actually in the fables about Baal, about their different gods, these were the kinds of things that Baal would do. He would be asleep, and it would be very important to wake him up before you got your answers. He could be busy or traveling. Busy, the word there is actually, he's otherwise occupied. He's relieving himself. He's on the toilet. And this is why Elijah's mocking, because he's like, what kind of God is going to be able to help you if he has his own needs, if he's sitting on the toilet? It's hilarious. But he's showing us there is a cost to worshipping a God that is not the real God, a Baal. And it's not just that he doesn't exist, right? That should be enough. That's why it says there's no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. How lonely is that? But the problem is even more tragic. The cost is even more tragic than this. The cost is it will hurt you. It will make you bleed. It will cost you too much if you trust in another God. This is where he goes next. So they shouted louder, and they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Actually, the cost of following a false God is that it will make you bleed. It went from dancing and limping, this drunken dance. The longer on it went, though, it became them slashing themselves. It's a bloodbath. I want to explore this with you a moment because I think this is really important to help you see what a false god is and what the cost of it is and how you can stop wavering and see the real God. You ready? Start answering some of our questions. I love this. David Foster Wallace, an American essayist. We're going to get there. Oh, I had all my stuff there. Cool. David Foster Wallace, an American writer, essayist, he did a commencement speech at a college. I feel like my YouTube channel is just full of commencement speeches. Anyone else? Is that just my algorithm? It's yours too? Steve Jobs has his commencement speech. Jim Carrey has his commencement speech. David Foster Wallace had his commencement speech. This is how the world shares their wisdom. And he said this. He said, I don't have the full quote up here, but I'll read you the full quote. He said, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. This guy is not a Christian, just a smart human being, a philosopher, and just worked a few things out. He said, there's no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshipping. He says, everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And he says, an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, we're starting to get a picture of what these other gods are for us. You worship money and things. If they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you'll never have enough. You'll never feel like you have enough. He says it's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you'll always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you'll die a million deaths before they finally plant you. He says maybe some of you worship power. If you worship power, you'll feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep fear at bay. Worship intellect, being seen as smart, and you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. And this is the thing he says we need to be aware of. He says, if it's not the real God, it will make you bleed. You're not worshiping the real God, it will make you bleed. These guys were literally cutting themselves. But what does it mean for us today? All of these things, of course, money, power, intellect, beauty, are all gifts from God. There's nothing wrong with them innately. Wanting kids, wanting to own a home, being successful, being attractive, they can be good things that God can give us. But they become gods in our lives, things that we worship, drums that we dance to, gods that we dance for, when they become the everything, when you have to have it for your life to be okay. That's what those gods are. Let's say, for example, it's a desire for a relationship, a desire to be married, if that's your thing. I was speaking to a friend this week about this, having a coffee at a cafe in Surry Hills. How good is Surry Hills? For coffee, you can't go wrong. Just go walk in the front door. It'll be a good coffee. Is that true most of the time? 99% of the time? I should say 1% of the time. That's what I care about. I care about my coffee. But the cafes in Surry Hills are pretty good. We're sitting down there, having lunch, and we're talking about this passage together. I'm fishing for ideas for a sermon. He's opening up his heart. And he said, I do have a desire to be married. I have a desire to be in a relationship. Single, 35, late 30s actually, probably. Great desire that he has. But he says it often goes beyond just a good desire. I know it goes beyond that. How do you know it often goes beyond? He said, because it makes me bleed. He says, because it becomes painful beyond what I can bear when I am broken up with. And he said, that should be a painful experience, right? There's investment, all that kind of thing. It will be a painful experience. But if it's unbearable to you, if it makes you despise of life itself, if you're trapped in a cycle of relationships that make you feel like that, then it's gone beyond a good desire. It's become something you worship. You're dancing to the beat of another drum, another god. You could do this about any other god. If it's having a particular lifestyle, level of comfort, then your mortgage could cost you more than you could bear. Not winning the auction or not getting the pay rise or the promotion could keep you in bed sick for weeks. If success is what really drives you, that will bleed you of friendships, of time with family, time doing other things. I'm going to move on to my last little question in a moment, but I just want to make one final point here on what it could cost you. I don't think any of us missed the moment where Elijah gathers up the false prophets and they get slaughtered. None of us missed that, right? Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. It's hard to miss that, right? The first thought we have is, what kind of a guy is Elijah? Like, this guy is crazy. This is not compassion or mercy. This is brutal. This is unforgivable. That's our first thought, I think. But I think this is what God is actually teaching us and revealing to us in this passage. The cost of worshipping another God. The blame here is not on Elijah, as if he's doing something way off balance or something he shouldn't have done. Nor is the blame actually on God, as if God is a merciless tyrant who can't deal with some kind of opposition to him. The reason for this is on them, actually. That's what this narrative tells us and what the scriptures tell us. These people knew what false worship meant. They knew that to lead God's people astray, God hates that. He doesn't want that for his people because it hurts them, it harms them. And to make sure it didn't happen again, there had to be something final. God has to stop this. He has to put an end to it. He has to be just. He has to be good to his people. He has to take care of the people he promised to take care of by eliminating the wolves that attack his flock. I think we find this really hard, not because we're more understanding than a primitive, ancient people. I think we find this hard to understand because we lack understanding about who God is, who the real God is, and we lack understanding about the cost of worshipping false gods and the cost of not following him. Remember, this is how Jesus felt about the issue himself. Jesus spent most of his ministry railing against religious people who told people lies about God. Jesus hated that. He had no time for that. And here Elijah is just carrying out God's anger at injustice. God's anger at the hurt that his people are experiencing. God's anger at people who are being led away from him and into death. And so I think the final question here we have this morning is, well, what will stop you wavering? What will stop you hurting yourself? What will bring you back to the true and living God? How do you know He's real? How do you know you can trust Him? How do you know that? How do you do that? Excuse me while I find my notes. Here they are. How do you see the real God? I think there's two sides to this coin this morning. The first is that you have to see the failure of your false gods. You have to see the failure of your own gods. You have to come to a point where you realize what they're costing you. You realize they don't exist. You realize this is not a contest between equal but slightly different things. You have to experience that for yourself, that there are no other valid options. That everything else in your life, if it's not the true and living God, every other thing that you make a God to get something that you want will fail you. You have to experience that. You have to see that. You have to experience that. I remember reading in a devotional many years ago, I think it was by A.W. Tozer. He was talking about what we should be praying for our friends who don't know Jesus. And he said, actually, don't pray that your friends, when they're in trouble, are lifted out of their trouble. Don't pray for that. He said, instead, pray that they would find God in their ditch, in their trouble. And more important than a change in their circumstances is a change in their heart. I want you to notice here, this is not a contest. This was pitched to you in the email this week, in my title. This was pitched to you as a contest between God and Baal. Problem with that is that Baal doesn't exist. It's like me going out and playing tennis against no one, right? No one being there. I'm fishing for tennis buddies, by the way. And, what's the point of that? Like, it's not a contest, is it? But there is a contest here. Where's the contest? It's between God and His people's wavering hearts. That's where the contest is. If you notice Elijah's prayer, when he prays, they've finished their dancing or whatever, Elijah prays, answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. The contest is between God and His people's hearts. God and His people's wavering hearts. And so how does God get your heart back? Well, the first thing is, we've talked about this, you've got to experience the failure of your gods. That's the first side of this. Naomi, me and my family, the last 2 days we've been in DY, North Shore, beautiful, enjoying the weather. And we were at a house that had these, I don't know how to say this, floor-to-ceiling glass between the inner dining living room area and the outdoor area. Have I explained that, right? It's a big window. And big windows, had really big windows. And I have a 3-year-old son who has he has learnt how to run, and running is everything to him at the moment. He'll come home from daycare, we live in an apartment, and he'll just go, Daddy, you want to run? And so we'll just run in the hallway. Our apartment's not big enough for him. And so we just spend hours running up and down this hallway. He thinks he's Lightning McQueen. Actually, you know the Cars movie? He doesn't think he's Lightning McQueen. Lightning was slow. He thinks he's Jackson Storm, who's like the new series of race cars. Anyway, he thinks he's Jackson Storm. And some of you are like, what is, Anyway, he's fast. He's really fast. Anyway, he's running around, and he ran straight into the glass. And he's at top speed as a 3-year-old. He's at top speed. And his face was all right. Thanks for asking. And Naomi and I were actually in the car on the way home, and she turns to me, and just quietly, this is front seat kind of conversation, so the back seat can't hear. Parents know what I'm talking about. And she said, I don't like seeing him hurt himself, but I love the cuddles. I love how he just he burrows himself into me afterwards. It's so nice. I thought, what an interesting thing to say, after our son had just slammed himself. God doesn't like seeing us hurt ourselves, but He will allow it to happen so that we can understand what He is like, so that we can know Him and enjoy Him and see His value and find Him and burrow our lives into Him. That's the first side of the coin. The second side of the coin, though, is you have to experience the real God. You have to see His love for you. How does that happen in this passage? It happens in this passage by fire and sacrifice, doesn't it? Fire and sacrifice. That's what's in the middle of this passage, a fire falling on a sacrifice. God is trying to win over the people's hearts. That's the contest, isn't it? How does he win over their hearts? Fire and sacrifice. What do I mean by that? Well, why do you waver? Why do you waver? Why do you waver between trusting God, having confidence in the real God, and going to other gods? I think it's because we don't believe he actually really loves us. We don't know his love for us. We don't believe he cares for us, protects us, has promised to never leave us, never forsake us. I think it's because we don't trust that. So what's fire and sacrifice got to do with it? How does that help us see God's love? What's interesting to me is this sacrifice. I don't think I got the passage there. I do. There we go. Great. The fire and sacrifice, they're both there. The sacrifice here, it says there in one of your verses, it says at the time of the evening sacrifice. I think that's really interesting. This is not a random miracle, as if the people have asked, show us a billboard in the sky, like just reveal yourself as God. This is not a random miracle. This happens at the time of the evening sacrifice. The sacrifice for God's people was this daily reminder of the cost of their idol worship, and a daily reminder that God would forgive them so that they could be right with him. It was this daily reminder of that. And so this bull is cut and this bull bleeds each and every day so that people would be reminded of God's grace, of his forgiveness for them. And in this passage, actually, there's a fire as well. The fire falls on the sacrifice to show that God's doing this. It's not them doing it for themselves. God is burning this up. And fire in the Old Testament also speaks, like sacrifice, speaks of judgment, speaks of God's judgment. And I think it's something like this. Because of the people's guilt, they deserve, because of their idol worship, they deserve God's judgment on them. God should rightly kill them, whether it be by a sword or by fire. God should rightly kill them. So what's God do? God sends fire. He does in this passage. But he doesn't send it on the people. He sends it on the sacrifice, on the cow, on the altar. And this is a foreshadowing. This is a picture, a window into what Jesus has done for us. Fire should fall on you because of your idolatry. You do go after money, power. You do go after relationships, sex. You do go after your intellect. You do those things. The fire should fall on you. But fire has fallen on Jesus. Fire has fallen on him. See, every other god will make you bleed for them, but the true God bleeds for you. And that's how you see the real God, the God of grace, the one you can trust, the one who is real, the one who loves you. Let me pray. Our gracious God, forgive us for having wavering hearts not just that are doubting or angry or upset or still have questions about who you are. It's not about that. It's about the times that we worship other gods, when we trust in other things to make us happy. We trust in other things to bring rain when there is drought in our lives. So forgive us for depending on other gods. But we're thankful that you desire to turn our hearts back to you. And so I just ask this morning that we would all see the failure of our other gods, the cost of worshipping them, and that we would see rather the cost that you paid to draw us back to you and to have us in relationship with you. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.